a world where truth changes overnight, where yesterday's enemy becomes today's ally, where language is simplified, not to clarify thought, but to control it. In 1949, George Orwell published a novel that would become one of the most disturbing political visions of the 20th century. But 1984 was not born from imagination alone. It was forged in war, in propaganda, in betrayal, in the slow realization that power does not only control people, it controls reality itself. Before he created Big Brother, before he imagined the Ministry of Truth, George Orwell witnessed something that changed him forever. And that experience would shape one of the most prophetic novels ever written. This is the story behind 1984 and the real events that made it possible. George Orwell was not born George Orwell. He was born Eric Arthur Blair in 1903 in British India at the height of the British Empire. He grew up in England, educated in prestigious schools, intelligent, observant, quiet. But in 1922, at just 19 years old, he made a decision that would shape his political awakening. He joined the Indian Imperial Police in Burma. For 5 years, he served the empire, enforcing laws, maintaining order, representing a system built on hierarchy and control. But something began to fracture inside him. He saw poverty. He saw resentment. He saw the quiet humiliation of a people governed by a distant power. And he realized something unsettling. Oppression dehumanizes not only the oppressed, but also the oppressor. Years later, he would write about these experiences in essays like Shooting an Elephant, not as propaganda, but as confession. The empire had taught him something crucial. Power is never neutral, and those who enforce it are never untouched by it. In 1936, Europe was trembling. Fascism was rising. Democracies were uncertain. When civil war erupted in Spain, Eric Blair did not remain an observer. He went, not as a journalist, but as a volunteer. He joined a militia aligned with the Republican forces. He believed he was fighting against tyranny. He believed in justice. The front lines were chaotic, poorly equipped, disorganized, but driven by conviction. Then, in 1937, a sniper's bullet struck him in the throat. He survived, barely. But the physical wound was not the one that changed him most. What shook him was something else. The war within the war. Factions on the same side began accusing each other of betrayal. Newspapers published events that had never happened. Allies disappeared overnight, rebranded as enemies. Orwell read reports describing battles he had personally witnessed and did not recognize them. Facts were rewritten. Narratives adjusted, reality reorganized. In Spain, he discovered something terrifying. Truth was not merely suppressed, it was manufactured. When Orwell returned from Spain, Europe was no longer trembling. It was transforming. Fascism in Germany. Stalinism in the Soviet Union. Competing systems, yet disturbingly similar in structure. These regimes did not rely only on violence. They relied on narrative, on repetition, on slogans, on the careful simplification of language. Words were no longer tools for describing reality. They became instruments for shaping it. Political language grew abstract, precise when it needed authority, vague when it needed concealment. Orwell began to understand something fundamental. Totalitarianism does not begin with camps or prisons. It begins with the erosion of objective truth. If facts can be adjusted, if records can be rewritten, if yesterday's statement can be denied without consequence, then power no longer needs to justify itself. It simply declares. In essays written during the 1940s, Orwell warned about this transformation. He criticized not only dictatorships, but also the intellectual laziness that allowed propaganda to flourish. He feared a society where citizens would accept contradiction without resistance. A society where war could be described as peace, where ignorance could be described as strength, where freedom could slowly be redefined until it meant obedience. By the mid-1940s, Orwell was no longer simply reacting to events. He was constructing a warning, not about one regime, but about a pattern. In 1946, George Orwell retreated to a remote island off the coast of Scotland. The world had just survived a global war. Fascism had been defeated, yet Orwell was not reassured. He believed something more subtle was emerging. He was ill. Tuberculosis was slowly consuming him. Isolated, physically fragile, yet mentally relentless. Burma had shown him the psychology of power. Spain had shown him the manipulation of truth. The war years had shown him the machinery of propaganda. Now, he began to combine them. He imagined a society not controlled by spectacle, but by structure. A world where surveillance was constant yet almost mundane, where fear was ordinary, where obedience was internalized. He created a face, not a detailed character but a symbol. Big Brother was less a person than a presence, an image that watched and reminded. He designed institutions that sounded almost reassuring. The Ministry of Love, the Ministry of Peace, the Ministry of Truth, each name a distortion. Perhaps his most radical invention was linguistic, newspeak, a language designed not to express thought but to limit it. If a word does not exist, can the idea survive? And then came doublethink, the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs at the same time and accept both, not as confusion, but as discipline. Orwell was not predicting the future. He was extrapolating patterns. He understood that totalitarianism did not depend on technology alone. It depended on compliance, on fatigue, on the gradual surrender of critical thought. He worked obsessively, despite worsening illness. Despite isolation, he knew he was writing something important, not a fantasy, but a warning. In 1949, 1984 was published. It was not welcomed as prophecy. It was read as fiction. History would slowly prove otherwise. When 1984 was published in June 1949, the world did not immediately interpret it as prophecy. The Second World War had ended only 4 years earlier. Europe was rebuilding. Nations were exhausted. The horrors of fascism were still recent, still tangible. Many readers approached Orwell's novel as a dark extrapolation, a fictional exaggeration born from wartime anxiety. Few suspected how enduring its vocabulary would become. What distinguished 1984 from other dystopian novels was not merely its atmosphere, but its language. Orwell did not only tell a story, he introduced concepts: Big Brother, thought crime, doublethink, newspeak. These were not decorative inventions. They were analytical tools disguised as fiction. Readers began using them to describe real political behavior. As the Cold War intensified, Orwell's novel gained renewed relevance. Surveillance expanded. Intelligence agencies operated in secrecy. Ideological rivalry shaped education, media, and diplomacy. Although Orwell died in 1950, his final work continued to circulate globally, translated into dozens of languages, debated in universities, referenced in speeches and essays. The novel was no longer simply read, it was cited. Over the decades, the vocabulary of 1984 embedded itself into cultural consciousness. When governments concealed information, critics invoked the Ministry of Truth. When public rhetoric normalized contradiction, commentators referenced doublethink. Orwell's fictional architecture became a diagnostic language for reality. Ironically, some of the novel's most discussed elements were technological telescreens, constant monitoring, surveillance without pause. Yet Orwell's deeper warning was psychological. Technology was only a tool. The true vulnerability was human adaptation. People adjust, they rationalize, they grow accustomed to intrusion. By the time the year 1984 actually arrived, the novel had already transcended its date. It was no longer about a specific future, it was about a recurring possibility. A pattern that could re-emerge whenever language weakens, whenever fear simplifies debate, whenever power escapes scrutiny. Many discussions about 1984 focus on surveillance technology, the telescreens, the omnipresent monitoring, the absence of privacy. Yet Orwell's deeper warning was not technological. It was psychological. Technology enforces, but acceptance sustains. The true danger lies in gradual adaptation, when intrusion becomes ordinary, when contradiction becomes routine, when language loses precision. When the calendar finally reached the year 1984, the novel did not expire. Instead, it evolved. It was no longer about a specific future. It became a recurring possibility, a structural pattern that can emerge whenever truth weakens, whenever fear simplifies debate, whenever power escapes accountability. Orwell did not predict a single regime. He mapped a structure, and structures can reappear in many forms. George Orwell did not write 1984 as a crystal ball. He was not attempting to predict a specific country, a specific leader, or a specific year. What he understood, with unusual clarity, was something far more subtle. Power does not always arrive violently. It often emerges gradually. It adapts. It normalizes itself. And when it reshapes language, it reshapes perception. When perception changes, resistance becomes harder to define. There are no uniform gray buildings marked Ministry of Truth. There are no telescreens mounted in every home, at least not in the way he imagined them. And yet, the questions he raised remain disturbingly contemporary. Who controls information? How does repetition shape belief? At what point does convenience replace privacy? And when does comfort reduce curiosity? The most enduring aspect of 1984 is not surveillance technology. It is psychological adaptation, the human ability to accept contradiction when it is repeated often enough, the ability to adjust memory when certainty becomes uncomfortable, and perhaps most importantly, the temptation to exchange complexity for simplicity. Orwell's warning was never about a single regime. It was about structure. Structures do not disappear. They evolve. They reappear in new forms. And they depend, ultimately, on human participation. 1984 endures not because it predicted the future, but because it understood the fragility of truth, and that fragility is never entirely behind us. But the story of 1984 did not end with its final page. In many ways, it was only beginning. When George Orwell finished the manuscript, he was already gravely ill. He was suffering from tuberculosis. Weak, isolated, and aware that his time was limited. He had written a novel about the suffocation of truth. While struggling to breathe himself, much of 1984 was written on the remote Scottish island of Jura. There was no comfort there, no luxury, just wind, isolation, and long hours of writing. The landscape was harsh. The ideas were harsher. The novel was almost called The Last Man in Europe, a title that sounds less political and more existential. But the year minus 1984 gave the warning a clock. 1984 was published in 1949. George Orwell died just months later. He never saw the full impact of what he had written. He never saw his vocabulary enter everyday language. Big Brother, doublethink, thought crime. Over the decades, the novel would repeatedly return to bestseller lists. During moments of political tension, during crises of trust, during times when language itself seemed unstable. Each generation believed the book was speaking directly to them. Long before 1984, Orwell had already seen ideology turn violent. In the 1930s, he traveled to Spain to fight in the Civil War. He believed he was defending freedom. What he encountered instead was fragmentation, propaganda, and betrayal within his own side. Orwell was not disillusioned by a single ideology. He was disillusioned by how easily language could be weaponized. He saw how slogans replaced thought, how loyalty replaced truth, how fear simplified complexity. To Orwell, the corruption of language was not a side effect of power. It was its foundation. When words lose precision, thought loses resistance. And when thought loses resistance, authority expands quietly. Orwell criticized totalitarianism in all forms. He distrusted authoritarianism, whether it appeared on the left or the right. His concern was not partisan, it was structural. He feared systems that demanded intellectual submission. That is why 1984 still feels alive, not because it predicted a device, but because it understood a pattern in human behavior. The enduring power of 1984 is often reduced to surveillance, cameras, screens, observation. But the novel is not fundamentally about being watched. It is about learning to watch yourself, internalizing the gaze, accepting contradiction before it is imposed. Doublethink is not simply a political strategy. It is a psychological survival tool. The ability to hold two contradictory beliefs and accept both, not because they are logical, but because rejecting them would be dangerous. This is why the novel survives changes in technology. It does not depend on outdated devices. It depends on something far more stable: human vulnerability. The desire for certainty, the comfort of belonging, the fear of isolation. Orwell understood something profoundly uncomfortable. Oppression does not always require force. Sometimes it requires participation. And participation often begins with language. That is why 1984 remains unsettling, not because it shows us a monster, but because it shows us a mirror.